Hi there. Thanks so much for joining me today for the latest episode of Impact Real Estate Investing. My guest today is Annie Donovan, COO at LISC, an organization deeply rooted in the community. Annie has built a truly remarkable career in community investment by embracing a pursuit of fairness in economics and finance. She found her way to this mission through her roots in Pittsburgh, growing up in a working-class family where she was exposed to ideas of social justice early in life. In no particular order, she has served as a senior policy advisor in the Obama administration's Office of Social Innovation, as the CEO of the social enterprise Cometrics, heading the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, and she spent 2 decades at Capital Impact Partners, all before taking over as COO at LISC. Be sure to go to evepicker.com to find out more about Annie on the show notes page for this episode, and be sure to sign up for my newsletter so you can access information about impact real estate investing and get the latest news about the exciting projects on my crowdfunding platform, Small Change. Hello, Annie. I'm really honored to have you on my show and pretty excited to talk to a fellow Pittsburgher.
Well, thank you, Eve. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm always thrilled and delighted to talk to Pittsburghers.
Good. So the first question I have is actually about Pittsburgh. So you grew up in Pittsburgh, and I'm wondering how that shaped the way you see the world.
Thank you for that question. It very much did shape the way I see the world. Well, first of all, let me just tell you a little bit about my context. I grew up on the north side of Pittsburgh from an Irish Catholic family. I am the 10th of 11 children.
Wow.
My father's family, so he was first generation American. His parents both came from Ireland. They actually bought a house on the north side. So the way that my parents were actually able to afford to raise a family that big was because my grandparents passed their home onto my parents, and so they never had to pay a mortgage. So that's how we sort of made ends meet economically, and we're able to create some mobility in our family.
What neighborhood was that?
Brighton Heights.
Oh, Brighton Heights. Okay.
Mm-hmm. But the things about Pittsburgh, when you're from there or when you've lived a long time there, Pittsburgh can take a hit for being provincial, and that's certainly the case. I mean, in my parents' generation, my parents had an ethnically mixed marriage because, my father was Irish and my mother was part German. But in their generation, people even went to church based on ethnicity. So there's a lot of that sort of ethnic pride, and it can feel a little provincial. But Pittsburghers are also very unpretentious and very warm and open-hearted, I think, and just possess a lot of resilience and, grit. Those are qualities that I'm very proud to have had instilled in me growing up that I've relied on throughout my career.
So, I think also what I noticed in Pittsburgh, and I heard stories about the steel mills actually purposefully separating neighborhoods into ethnicities.
Yes.
And that sort of prolonged that here. And it's made the city architecturally interesting because the neighborhoods are really distinctive and unique.
Yes, yeah, very much so.
Look very different. It's fascinating. And then, of course, there's the managers' neighborhoods and the steelworker neighborhoods. So
Right. And, interestingly, what happened in my family, I grew up in a working class neighborhood, and it was very working class. My father actually went to school at night and earned a college degree from Duquesne. And he was the only person in the neighborhood who had a college degree. And he was an accountant. He worked for the Allegheny County. So we had this interesting blend of, when our country was experiencing sort of white flight, right? So lots of white folks moving out to the suburbs.
Yes.
And those white folks moved out, and then they went on toward more upward mobility. And we stayed in the working class neighborhood, but we were still, in my family, able to experience upward mobility because we owned our home and my father had a college degree.
Degree. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What led you into the world of community finance?
I had always had, I think, a heart for social justice work. I thought a lot about poverty, and I thought a lot about the kind of injustices that were in my world growing up. Of course, I was born in 1964, Pittsburgh being, not only ethnically divided, but lots of really hard lines around racial division as well.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I have to hand it to my mother, because when we were growing up, this was probably the mid 70s, and my brothers, well, so in my family, there are 6 girls and then 3 boys, me and a boy. So it's almost like having 2 generations, and I grew up with the boys. They wanted to start a street hockey league. And, so of course I was out there playing street hockey with them. I'm a Title IX gal, and they were looking for a coach. And so they put an ad in the newspaper, and a guy responded to it, and his name was Curtis. He was from the Hill District. And of course, the Hill District is the historically Black neighborhood. And so they signed him up, and he came over to Brighton Heights, which was a very white place, and coached the street hockey team.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that just got me thinking about, like, why do we have these divisions? And I had these ideas of what people from Black communities were supposed to be like, and he wasn't like that. He wasn't like my image. And my mother, they'd play street hockey, and it'd be time for dinner. And of course, whoever was around, my mother invited in for dinner. So oftentimes Curtis would eat dinner with us. When we said grace before dinner, the way he bowed his head and prayed, it just struck me that everything I'd kind of learned about our Black neighbors, I didn't see in him. And so it got me thinking, like, what was all that education about? And so I've always been on a quest to understand what these racial lines are too, and what the class lines are. And so, I studied economics in college. Early on in my journey there, it was a 101 economics class, and we were learning about rational thinking and optimization. And I remember thinking, well, this isn't really a fair way to allocate resources across a society. And so I said that to my professor afterwards, who was, a classically trained economist who was like Chicago school. And he said, well, this isn't about fairness, it's about efficiency. And that was like, okay, I've found my mission.
Oh.
And so, and then I joined the Peace Corps, went to the Peace Corps after college, lived in a very poor place. And then, then it really sunk in, because the people that I lived around were supremely resourceful and smart and really dirt poor. And so what was that about? So that's when I became, sort of even more fiercely committed to it. And that's been the pursuit of my career since then, is how do we use the tools of economics and finance, and how do we rewrite them in a way that produces a more inclusive prosperity, because we are leaving a lot of talent on the table.
Okay. So you've had some really big roles, from the White House to the head of the CDFI fund, and now you're at LISC. And I'm wondering, I'm familiar with LISC. I actually benefited from a loan from LISC years ago.
Good.
For one of my projects. And I'm wondering what brought you there.
Yeah. So what brought me to LISC was, after my experience at the CDFI fund, I knew I wanted to go back into practice, because that's kind of where my heart and soul lies. And so one of the characteristics about LISC is that it's very committed to local initiatives as part of our name. And I wanted to be in a place that was toiling more closely to the ground We have local offices. We have 35 and growing local offices that really are programmatically focused, and they're focused on capacity building alongside lending. And so that's where I saw the ability to more closely connect those pieces and not just be finance oriented, but to get deeper, closer to the community. And then the second thing was I saw in Maurice Jones a leader in our industry who is boldly ambitious, is ambitious for the sake of impact. And I was attracted to that as well. So yeah, so that's what drew me to LISC.
And then, like, talking about community capital, what does community development capital look like today versus 20 years ago?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think 20 years ago, if you think about, or even 25 years ago, the sort of the history of community development or community capital, community investment, the community investment world really, it braids together organizations and institutions that come from different origin stories. So there's the origin story of the Black-owned banks and minority depository institutions that got underway right after emancipation for Black Americans to build wealth. There is the credit union movement that was tending to people of modest means who wanted to come together and save together and have access to financial services that were owned and controlled by them. And then you had the nonprofit loan fund world that emerged because community development really took shape in the war on poverty and the commitment of the federal government to funding community development corporations. There was an era there where there's a lot of federal funding. And we can talk about urban policy and how that, CDC's kind of shifted urban policy. But then in the beginning of the Reagan era is when the feds really pulled back. And that's when loan funds really started to emerge to say, well, we have to create new ways to finance the activity of community development. And that's when the loan funds really started taking root. And then when Clinton came into office, he created the CDFI fund. And that has been a really important policy innovation, still is a policy innovation today, that has been investing the kind of equity capital that the industry needs to grow that you can't really get anywhere else. So the industry has really blossomed, partly because we had good seed capital, and partly because we just have been a bunch of people who have had a faith in the people and the communities that we're investing in, and have found a way to work with traditional and non-traditional sources of capital to blend them in a way that allows investments to work in places where my old economics professor would have said you wouldn't invest in because it wasn't efficient, the rate of return wasn't commensurate with risk, and all those sort of traditional measures. That's the reason capital doesn't flow to some of the communities that we care about. And we are becoming more mainstream. And even though we're still a tiny percentage of the financial services sector, I think even through the pandemic, you start to see CDFIs emerge, getting more attention in mainstream media. And certainly LISC has we've been able to raise a lot of resources through this pandemic because there's a recognition, and we've not only done the investing and gotten the money there where people said it can't go, but we've done it financially in a fiscally responsible way. So we've proven that the places and the people we're investing in are creditworthy. That has allowed this industry to grow, and I think it's going to continue to grow. I'm optimistic about that.
Years ago, I helped found a CDC in Pittsburgh. And what was really fascinating to me, because I was pretty new here and I didn't really understand this lay of the land very well. I sort of dropped in from another country. But all of the work we did was to get us to the same place as neighborhoods and places that were doing okay. And I've been in this world for a long time, and we never seem to get there. And so I'm wondering, because when you take a step forward with CDFIs, and maybe this is, a really naive way to look at it, but you take a step forward with CDFIs and you take a step back with banks who no longer really want a banking or lending communities, or want more equity, or want, more traditional products to lend in. And it's just this never ending catch up. So how does it all get better?
Yeah. So of course, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I think a lot of folks have been soul searching around this, particularly because of the uprisings demanding more, racial
Equity,
that
yeah.
we address racial equity. Um, and so it does often feel like, some days it really just feels like we are just doing the work of putting band-aids on things. And that's where I think the work right now is really important, because we can't be satisfied with what we've done because it's clearly not enough. Um, but I think we are in a moment that we have to make the best use of, because we can't do this on our own with our little bitty organizations. And even if we're $1 billion or $2 billion or $10 billion, we're still too itty bitty to create change on the scale that needs to happen. But that doesn't mean this stuff shouldn't happen, and it does have to happen, because even over my career, 25 years ago, if somebody had said that you'll be working for a CDF, or you will help build a CDFI that will get to be $1 billion, wow, that would have been, because these loan funds were starting they just wanted to get to 10 million,
Right.
And we wouldn't have the opportunities that are in front of us now if we hadn't taken all those baby steps to get to here. So over the long haul, I hope that we can get there, but there's the bigger, we have to be able to impact the bigger picture. And for example, it was discouraging to me when I was at the CDFI fund in the second 2 years I was there under this administration, that that a tax policy got enacted that just felt like it was gonna undo everything that we were trying to do. So there are these macro forces that that we have to try to turn the tide on.
That's depressing, but I know, but I know it's a really long, patient game, because I've seen that, in things I've worked on that initially were like, what are you doing? You're nuts, to now being, okay, this is mainstream, like co-working or
Right.
lofts downtown or revitalizing
Exactly.
downtowns, or all of that. And we're actually, I think you're
Exactly.
right, we're in a moment, all of the progress we were heading towards has been unbelievably compressed by everything that's happened this year. So maybe that's a
Right.
good thing, but
Yeah, and I think that it's also very complex too, right? Because even we see in some places tremendous progress running exactly alongside of things that feel like tremendous regression.
yes.
So, and both of those things are happening at the same
Well,
time.
I'm going to ask you, you may not know the answer, but I really puzzle about what's happening in traditional financial institutions. Um, so, I have this crowdfunding platform, and what's been startling to me, and our purpose is to help raise money for creative change making projects and help developers get a little equity together. That it seems to be a little more and more equity every year as banks change their position on what they'll lend for, because we think that creative, those projects are important for making cities better. But it seems to
Yes.
me that they're retracting even further, because we're just being flooded at the moment, and and equity requirements go up. It just seems to be harder and harder to borrow money to do things that are different than the things we have today. And we know we need to do things differently to fix some problems.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the way I think about this and what I see from my perch is that um, I think that we have to we have to start thinking about the world beyond banks, and think about and work hard on this. The idea of having broader stakeholders. I mean, banks have been brought to the table on community finance because of the Community Reinvestment
Right.
Act. And so what are the ways in which there might be policy levers that need to be pulled to get more folks to the table, but also, um, you know, what the next generation of employees and employers. I mean, I think that we're in for change, and I'm really hoping that we're in for change with the next generation of leaders because they have been raised with different expectations and they are already changing um, corporate, the way corporations are
Mm-hmm.
reacting. And we see now, we've been the beneficiary of almost $100 million in corporate contributions that are going out to small businesses, as in this pandemic, as in the form of relief
Yeah, that's pretty
grants.
fabulous.
And what we did was the first one that came in, the first corporation that came in and said, "Can you do this for us?" And we said, "Yes, we can do it for you, but we're going to do it in our LISC way." And that means we are going to get to community serving businesses that are majority owned by people of color and women. And they said, "Okay, cool. Go ahead and do it." And then the next company that came in said, "We want to buy that. We want to buy," especially as PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and SBA, major piece of the CARES Act, was clearly written in a way that was just going to follow the old rules for how you distribute capital. And then people started saying, wait, there have to be other ways to do this. And so the work that we were doing was tipping the scales. We put our thumb on the scale in favor of community serving, small businesses, and gave preference. And we're ending up with, somewhere in the low 90% of the businesses that we're funding are owned by people of
Yeah,
color.
that's pretty great.
And yeah, and in the Paycheck Protection Program, we got to about 80% of our companies being minority women and women-owned companies. And when you put together, and on the private sector side, our formula was we're going to advantage certain census tracts, we're going to advantage minority ownership and women ownership, and we're going to advantage certain size. So when you line all those up, it's not that hard to come up with lots of folks to invest
Yeah,
in.
yeah, yeah.
And that's where our money's gone.
So another question I have is looking at the other side of it. If a real estate developer has access to community capital, what should her reciprocal responsibilities be to that community?
I think that's really, really very important because, and we have to all get better at this as well, in terms of how we do in community engagement, and how we're bringing people into ownership of what happens at the community level. And so I think, there are just these models, and this seems to me to be what's out there on the fringe right now. And it's always what's happening on the fringe that's eventually going to be where we all go, hopefully. But what I see is I've been advising on a project that's being done by a foundation, a philanthropy. It's not a traditional philanthropy; it's one of the newer philanthropies, and they are they're investing in a real estate project in one of the just most distressed census tracts in Washington, D.C. And they are bringing together community stakeholders to say, how do we create a vehicle for people who live in that community right now before the development happens? How do we create a vehicle for them to invest in it and to get ownership in it? And those are, I think, the kind of strategies we need to be thinking about. How do we, because otherwise, if you just let this play out via market forces, you get gentrification a lot of times.
Right.
So, we don't want to go in that direction, and that means giving people real ownership stakes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's what we do at Small Change. I'm having similar conversations with some very large developers who are starting to think about that ownership piece in really humongous projects in DC and New York. And it's really exciting to see that people are thinking about it. It is hopeful. So,
Yeah, and if you think about another example, and this is not at the project level, this is at the fund level, but we're going to be managing money on behalf of Netflix. And Netflix went out, and this was somebody inside Netflix who said, in their treasury department, why are we sitting on all this money and not thinking about where it's invested? Why don't we get this to Black-owned institutions? And that's when, back to your question, when are we ever going to see this get better? I mean, that's when it's going to get better,
yes.
right? When that person inside that corporation goes to the CEO and the CEO says, yeah, absolutely. Why aren't we doing that?
Yes, yeah.
And then you put it out there. And when Netflix put that out there and they made the investment in us, we had so many corporations respond to say, well, how do we do that too? So that's what we have to do. We have to create the bandwagon, but the bandwagon that's moving money in this direction.
Yeah. So, I mean, how would you define impact investing then?
Okay, so impact investing, to me, I always define it as it's a spectrum, right? Because I think it's important for all of us to have a big umbrella and be inclusive, right? And on one end of the impact investing spectrum are the folks that would say, you can invest and do good and do well at the same time, right? And there's not really a trade-off. And then the other end of the spectrum is, where my work has always been, which is on the, whether you call it concessionary or catalytic capital, where you're trying to, because on that first end of the spectrum, you're not disrupting any kind of the market forces. You're sort of saying the market can do this, but there's something missing in terms of information flow. So if everybody had perfect information, then that would solve the problem. So I've never bought into that because I don't think that it accounts for the systemic racism that exists in our society and in our economy. And so I think you have to be more disruptive than that. And that requires capital that can be designed and stacked and engineered in a way that allows more people to get access to it, to do the kind of projects, to create the kind of businesses that are going to let them into more economic activity. So yeah, and my dream is always, and my work is always trying to think about how do we get the people who are on one end of the spectrum down toward the catalytic end, because if you want to disrupt poverty, you can't do it on the market end, purely market end.
Interesting. I mean, impact investing's been growing. I still think it's small. Do you expect? I suppose I'm wondering if you expect the events of this year to rapidly increase interest in that too. Well, certainly if you see it from Netflix.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think the question is, the question that's on our mind at LISC is how do we convert the short-term interest into long-term relationships?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we get people to see? Because actually, frankly, in the short run, um, it's good for a corporation's brand to step up and do this
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
work. I mean, yeah, and there's not really much at stake there, and frankly, you know, they could direct if they wanted to. They could purely direct this out of their PR budgets.
Yes.
You know, and so how do we convert people to the long term play? That's the work that's in front of us right now.
Right. So, just shifting gears a little bit, what do we need to think about to make our cities and neighborhoods just better places for everyone?
Yeah. I think that we have to we have to think comprehensively, first of all. So I don't think that's another reason that I wanted to join LISC is because I like the comprehensive approach, because I don't think there's any one dimension to neighborhood life that is a silver bullet, right? So we have to invest more in education, and housing stability is, fundamental to economic mobility. And so we have to invest in all of these things. And, you know, um, back to the big picture of tax policy and how we tax and spend.
Mm-hmm.
I do think we just, the thing is, we know exactly what we need to do.
Yes.
We just have to invest in it,
Yes.
right? We know the payoff of early childhood education. We know the payoff of education in general. We know the payoff of preventive healthcare. So, what more evidence do you need? We just need to have the will and the commitment as a society. And once that's there, I think everything else
Yeah.
follows.
And I see it physically too. We know the payoff of neighborhood parks and better streets and better lighting
Yes,
and
absolutely.
all of those things that everyone wants in their own neighborhood and some people don't have.
Right.
And
Right. And we have to develop our collective will to say that that's not okay. That's not the world we want to live in.
so what community engagement tools have you seen that have worked that, you mentioned that that's a critical piece of it and that's hard. Um,
It is
yeah.
hard. It's hard for a lot of reasons, one of which is that when community developers who don't know community, if they don't know the community, if you're coming in to this, as a sort of professional, you may have certain assumptions about what people in. I think one of the things we make a mistake on this all the time, like, what does the community want? Well, you know what, not everybody in the community agrees on
No,
what
that's
they
right.
want, just like in your community,
Yes. Yeah.
so I think starting with listening, and being open, um, is really, really important. And so I mentioned the project where, in Washington D.C., where the funder was coming in and actually saying, okay, we want to do we want the result of to be that people have an ownership stake, but why don't we find out from the community what that means to them,
Mm-hmm.
how they would do it, what is that what's really wanted, so I think good community engagement starts with listening, not making assumptions, and bringing people in, and just providing the space for voices to be heard and listened to, um, and just having a faith in that's gonna lead you down the right path, is a good way to get people involved. And I think that also, when I started my career, after I got back from the Peace Corps, I went to work for the Campaign for Human Development. And in that work, we funded a lot of community organizing. And the ability of communities to organize themselves is also an important piece of this. Like there's very little investment that goes into community organizing. And I think that's a really important component.
That's what I was just going to say, because I think about, like, when you're a very large developer doing a large scale project, you can absorb that community organizing piece. But when you're a small developer doing like interstitial projects that are, fit into a neighborhood, that becomes a pretty heavy lift in terms of resources and who's there to help, and how do you get that done properly? It's hard. It's hard.
Right. And it's also, and we need more philanthropy dollars in that, because that's a really hard role for government to play. And I know we administer a lot of Section 4 money, and that's out of the HUD budget. And that's for capacity building of local organizations. And it's really hard money to work with.
Yes. Yeah.
It's so there's a need for investment of flexible dollars into neighborhood organizing and leadership development.
Yeah. No, I agree. So what's next for you and LISC? I mean, what do you think the next 5 years will look like in this pretty fast moving time that we're having here?
Yes. So, well, I think that we are on a pathway, moving to the next level of growth and scale. And for us, that's about how do we use the assets that we've built so far to get to that next level. And I think for us, putting impact first, the racial equity piece of this is really important. And I think I am very hopeful that we are going to be able to do the deeper work there, that, and we're going to, choose the pathway of doing the harder, deeper work, because the long-term outcome is going to be better. And we're going to, try to bring our partners along for that ride. And I think that we are, through this period, we have greatly increased our capacity to reach small businesses, and to think about inclusive economic development. How do we build the infrastructure for more inclusive economic development and ecosystems that support small community, owned or locally owned small businesses. And we have to be thinking about how are we disrupting systems. So, because we're at the edges of them now, in terms of their usefulness, and we have to build something that's built to suit for the next level of scale.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I really can't wait to see what you build and where LISC goes and where you go with all of this.
Well, thank you. And I love the work that you're doing. Every dimension, that every strategy that brings in more capital and the more of the kind of equity capital that you're pulling in, and democratizing that, I think is a really powerful strategy. And I also wish you the best of luck.
Let's hope it all takes hold. Thank you, Annie.
Yes, I can't wait to see that happen.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
That was Annie Donovan. Annie thinks we need to start thinking about the world beyond banks. We need to find a way to let communities invest in order to change how we tackle development, to give them a real stake in their own future. Listening is key, as is providing the space for people to be heard. For Annie, impact investment needs to have a big umbrella and be deeply inclusive. She also understands playing the long game, saying that we know exactly what to do, but that we need to develop as a society the collective will to invest in that knowledge. You can find out more about impact real estate investing and access the show notes for today's episode at my website, evepicker.com. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to find out more about how to make money in real estate while building better cities. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today, and thank you, Annie, for sharing your thoughts. We'll talk again soon, but for now, this is Eve Picker signing off to go make some change.